You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Sabah al-Khair, good morning dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Good morning, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Remembered. Thanks so much for all of the support I'm getting across all of my social media and emails and everything. You know, the messages that continue to flood in far outweigh and dwarf the hate. Although that said, I do get a little bit of hate. And it's exacerbated when the Zionists cut bits out of context. And if you're at the Melbourne rally last Sunday, I spoke about a place where we might all belong, a world that we're trying to build together. And I said, Melbourne is ours, Australia is ours, the world is ours. And if you were there, it was really some of my best work, really quite rousing at the end, just before we're about to start to march. And a Zionist decided to clip just those perhaps 5 seconds. Melbourne is ours, Australia is ours, the world's ours. And it went quite viral. And I know when a Zionist has done something about me or has cut something and remixed it in some way, because my phone, when I wake up, is alight with notifications as to things that perhaps I should know about or have missed. And so this Melbourne is ours, Australia is ours, the world is ours. Get out of Australia, deport you, sand N-word, and many other very descriptive words, choice words, all over my social medias. I then got a phone call from the producer of Melbourne's 3AW, a far inferior radio station to Radio 3CR, which you're listening to now. And if you haven't, please make sure you subscribe. Go to 3cr.org.au. Keep shows like Palestine Remembered and so many other great shows on the air. From the producer saying, Nasser, Tom wants to speak to you about this clip. Was this you? I said, yeah. He said, he'd like to speak to you about it. And Tom said, so Nasser, what's this about? I said, well, firstly, I want to thank whomever decided to clip that and give me the opportunity to get on the radio, because although the genocide is still going on in Gaza, although Palestinians are still being slaughtered and murdered, starved, denied medicine, aid, etc., although we're in a ceasefire where Palestinians have ceased and Israelis continue to fire, we're not getting any airtime anymore. Nobody seems to care. And he said, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, it was at the end of my speech. And if you'd listen to the rest of the speech, I talk about a world where we fight against all hate, where we fight against homophobia, where we fight against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, ableism, where we fight against all hate. And that world that we're trying to build together, that the Palestinian or the movement for the liberation of Palestine, for Palestinian self-determination, that fight is an ecumenical fight, a fight that calls on all people who see and hope for a just world to come together. And that if we can build that world together, that's going to be a better world. And that world will be ours, Melbourne, Australia, and the world. And he said to me, oh, okay, so you're not advocating for some sort of Islamic caliphate. I got to say, I was a bit astonished that these words would come out of this bloke, but, private school, Melbourne white boy father was the president of the Liberal Party. Perhaps he actually hasn't been out there. That yes, there are some of us who believe that all people should be equal and all people should be equally loved and all life is equally precious, and that we should be listening to Indigenous folk wherever we are on how to care for land and country. And he said, it's a bit utopic, a bit It's not really going to happen, is it, mate? And I said, look, I want to fight for that world, and I want to hope that the work we can do together builds that world for our children. And I said, I want that world that Martin Luther King spoke about, where you judge me by the content of my character, not the colour of my skin. Anyway, it didn't stop the hate. In fact, I probably accelerated it, because some people are really upset by a world where everybody might be equal. Imagine that, a world where everybody might be equal, the people would be upset by that. Anyway, that moves us straight on to Sky News' anti-Semitism summit. And if you ever want to know what's wrong with our country today, what has happened post October 7, and a alternative Prime Minister who has weaponized anti-Semitism, has created such division within our community by creating a hierarchy of hate, that when he was, I think it was October 8 or 9, said that anybody that marches under a Hamas flag must be deported. Just absolutely virulent attacks on our movement, through to the anti-Semitism summit. And for listeners that aren't aware of it, Sky News, Shari Markson decided to have an anti-Semitism summit where they had such wonderful people like Deborah Conway, Josh Frydenberg, Tony Abbott speak about anti-Semitism. But they also had our Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, KC, the son of Holocaust survivors, speak about anti-Semitism. Now, you would think the Attorney General, a King's Counsel, a Member of Parliament, an eminent career. Now, let's be clear, Nasser is not endorsing Mark Dreyfus. Nasser is no fan of Mark Dreyfus. In fact, I think he's not a great unit. But he is a human being. We are in Australia. He was at an anti-Semitism summit as the son of Holocaust survivors. He was at this summit and he was jeered. He was booed. That's what Peter Dutton has done to our country. Overnight in South Australia, he's proposed laws to change the Constitution to allow him, or whomever is the Home Affairs Minister, to deport people. He wants to change the Constitution. Now, let's be clear, this is the sort of talk that leads us to fascism when you start changing the laws. And we see by executive order what the leader, quote-unquote, of the free world is doing, Donald Trump, by executive order. He's proposing constitutional changes to deport migrants engaged in hate crimes. Now, let's be clear, he's talking about one cohort of people, us, and he's protecting another cohort of people, Australian Zionist Jews. This is outrageous. The weaponisation of anti-Semitism has been framed as anti-racism work, and it's done under a pretext to try and silence us, and it's beyond shameful. We know anecdotally, but also reportedly, but as well as that, what we are seeing out in the real world. And what we're seeing in the real world is an astronomical rise in anti-Palestinian racism. Anti-Palestinian racism. And I've been having conversations with so many different people, and I get asked, particularly by reporters, about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, as if it's a binary. There is no binary. This is not Muslim v. Jew. Remember, the world's most famous Christian, Jesus, was Palestinian. And I often talk about the fact that my mother's Christian. My father was a Muslim. I married a Muslim. Both my brothers married Catholics. What my nephews and nieces experience is not Islamophobia. It's anti-Palestinian racism. It's anti-Palestinian racism when a group of Australian Zionist Jews create a WhatsApp group of 600 people and say, what do we do? Can we possibly make sure that Clementine Ford never gets a publishing deal again? Or how do we target her to make sure she can't? Amongst others. I got to tell you, that's not, I think it was called Creatives for Israel. That's not Islamophobia. That's anti-Palestinian racism. They're targeting an activist, a human being, an Australian, not because of her race or her religion, but because of her stance for justice for the Palestinian people. Anti-Palestinian racism when a world-renowned Australian pianist, Jason Gilham, speaks to a piece that was composed by a Palestinian artist about silencing of journalists. When he plays that piece, and the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra cancels his contract, which ends up with, brilliantly, the MSO, the actual orchestra, voting a no confidence motion in the board and seeing massive resignations, etc. of the board and the CEO. That's anti-Palestinian racism. Jason's not an Arab, not a Muslim, played a piece of music, gets sacked. When Peter Laylaw, a 50-year veteran, one of Australia's most decorated, venerated, loved cricket commentators, is sacked from his commentating gig mid-tour because the owner or CEO of that radio station says people have called in and they don't feel safe when they hear your voice, because Peter had been sharing tweets. Brilliantly, Peter Laylaw, tweet yesterday, I think, has donated the entirety of his last cheque from the SEN, it's a radio network, to UNICEF. So thank you so much, Peter. That's not Islamophobia, that's anti-Palestinian racism. When Antoinette Lattouf shares a Human Rights Watch post that the ABC itself shared, this post, and she gets sacked. I mean, she's an Arab woman, she's a brown woman, so an easy target, but she's Christian. And not Islamophobia, it's anti-Palestinian racism. When reporters don't ask tough questions of Israeli firsters, of Zionists, of apologists for the genocide, because they fear the letter-writing campaign that might come, because they don't want to be quote-unquote Lattoufed, that's internalised anti-Palestinian racism. The ABC a week or so ago had a genocide apologist on the show there, a colonel with the army. This is the guy that went into the hospital and said, here's a list of all the hostages. That was, in fact, just a list of, it was a calendar, a handwritten calendar. The same guy that propagated the malicious and fictitious, which became, accepted norm, of 40 beheaded babies. They gave this guy 10 minutes, not once did they ask him, did he regret propagating that lie? Not once. Yet every time I get anywhere, if it isn't, will you condemn Hamas? Will you condemn those Bankstown nurses? Will you condemn what they said? Will you condemn this or will you condemn that? When reporters don't challenge these Israeli firsters, these apologists, when they don't challenge them, it's because of internalised anti-Palestinian racism, because they're scared. When it takes 3.5, almost 4 days for the Prime Minister to speak up against the Islamophobic attack on 2 women at the Epping shopping centre, 4 days. And he says, I'm not going to comment because those matters are before the police. But when the Bankstown nurse video comes out, and we should be clear, what they said is unacceptable. And no one should be defending what they said. We should be creating any circumstances where they are defending what they said. But what those nurses are entitled to is due process. What they are entitled to is an investigation. What they are entitled to is the full exploration of the entirety of the video, unedited, unclipped, and then they should face the repercussions of their actions. That's a reality. But a due process. There shouldn't be an Olympic medal sport, whether it's the state health minister, the national health minister, the premier, the opposition leader, or the prime minister, each of them increasing with vehemence the march to the gallows. Due process. The hypocrisy of outrage, the hypocrisy of outcome, whether it is to do with the Australian Zionist community or the Australian Palestine Solidarity community, it is what is destroying social cohesion. And we need to get away from this. We need an equality of outcome. We need to treat them all the same. I'm really, really happy to say, I'm a little bit proud as well. I know the team and we've done so much work on what is anti-Palestinian racism and why it needs to be defined. And in fact, the Australian Human Rights Commission has released a report, Beyond Care, where they are talking about anti-Palestinian racism. And it is heartening to see that there's a definition in there. It speaks to the fact, what a lot of people went beyond that binary of Muslim and Jew, that there are Palestinian Christians. and that, what they feel and experience is not Islamophobia. So a big shout out to the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Commissioner and the President there who are doing this work. And hopefully we can see, a space that is better. Because when a society silences its artists, Clem Ford, Jason Gilham, when it silences its writers, Clem Ford, Louis Dubois, when it silences those people, when it chases them, when it creates a space where people are self-censoring, that is the slide into fascism. Societies work best when there is a discourse that is challenging, when the academic space is challenging, and we need to create those spaces. We cannot be using anti-racism work under the veil of the weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence criticism of ideologies. And let's be clear, we are here in this space because the Israel Firsters, the Zionists, have created the unholy Trinity. Not the Holy Trinity, we're not talking about the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. We're talking about the unholy Trinity, where the Venn diagram of Israel, a piece of land, Zionism, a political ideology, and Judaism, an ancient Abrahamic religion, where those three words are synonyms: Israel, Zionism, Judaism. The three are three separate things. Israel's a country, Zionism is a political ideology, Judaism is a religion. There are times when the three will intersect, absolutely. And those times when those three intersect, you are being anti-Semitic. But criticizing Israel for a genocide, criticizing Israel for starving people, criticizing Israel for holding 10,000 Palestinian hostages, criticizing Israel for the past 16 months killing almost 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank, displacing more than 40,000 people, over almost 2,000 settler attacks, mini pogroms, if you will, over 1,000 Palestinian homes destroyed. This is since October 7, where, remember, we're targeting Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But in the West Bank, in occupied Palestinian territory, these attacks have been going on unrestrained. Criticizing that is not anti-Semitism. When you criticize the state of Israel and its political ideology, an ideology based in white supremacism, of Zionism, not that Jews need a homeland to feel safe. We get that. But the concept of Zionism as it exists today, that a Jewish homeland has to be at the expense of Palestinians, at the oppression of Palestinians, and at the continued destruction of Palestine, no ideology that is founded in that sort of hate has a right not to be criticized. In fact, it's incumbent upon all of us to be criticizing it. Zionism is racism. Let's be very clear. And Judaism is a religion. It's an Abrahamic faith. The 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. Love thy neighbor as thou love thyself. All of the wonderful things. If you lived your life, whether you're a Muslim, Christian, Jew, atheist, Buddhist, whatever, if you lived your life under the 10 Commandments, you'd have a pretty good life. Don't steal, don't murder, don't hate. If your neighbour's hungry, feed them. If your neighbour's house burnt down, house them. That's a wonderful couple of rules to live your life by. So I'd suggest Zionists go back to the 10 Commandments, get away from this racist narrative that you've been programmed to, and understand that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and that all of Abraham's children need to be safe.
Kufiyas are Palestinian scarves, and they're a symbol of support for justice for the Palestinian people. From the traditional black and white kufiya to an array of modern designs, explore the range and order online or drop by 3CR during business hours. Wear your support for the rights of Palestinians. Go to kufiyas.org.au, that's kufiyas.org.au. A 3CR supporter.
Stay locked to 3CR.
I'm going to talk to you about what happens beyond the ceasefire. We talk about ceasefire, but we also talk about what needs to happen after that. And it's so simple, particularly for those that have just joined the fight for liberation for Palestine, that we just want a ceasefire. Well, we don't just want a ceasefire. We absolutely do need a ceasefire. We need the killing to stop, the bombing to stop. But what we need is Palestinian self-determination. A ceasefire is not enough. And what we need is not the ceasefire that we've had 5 times before in the past 17 years in the slaughterhouse, in the concentration camp, in the open-air prison that Israel's created of Gaza, where Gaza gets, quote-unquote, rebuilt for Israel to, quote-unquote, mow the lawn again. This is a euphemism Zionists use for quelling the natives whenever they uprise, mowing the lawn. What needs to happen is Gaza, Palestine needs to be rebuilt by Palestinians, in conjunction with Palestinians, led by Palestinians. Self-determination is where Palestinians are in charge of themselves. In the past, what has happened is the countries have joined hands and raised money and sent that money to international bodies, and they've said, you need this, and Israel said, well, nothing can go in there if it doesn't come through here. And so, hypothetically, if you were to use just a simple example of concrete or steel or whatever it might be, this money sits in a pool, and the Gazan authorities want 10 tons of concrete, or I'm not sure how concrete gets delivered, 1 truck of concrete. They have to purchase it using that money, and that money has to come through Israel, and so the Israeli Concrete Company supplies that concrete. After every demolition of Gaza, the Israeli GDP, the Israeli economy is boosted. It's shameful. America and Israel and anyone else that supplied Israel with weaponry must be made to pay reparations to the Palestinians to rebuild Palestine. It's on them. It's not Donald Trump turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East. Beyond shameful. When he speaks about they'll all have to leave, when he says I'll speak to Egyptians and the Jordanians and they'll take the Palestinians, it's shameful. What's also shameful is when our government doesn't say we reject this. Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom, a rabid Zionist, and I got to tell you, like a proper horrible person, when he has the capacity to say no, why isn't our Prime Minister saying that too? Why is he equivocating? Australia has a bipartisan commitment to a two-state solution. We're not talking about two-state solutions here. He's talking about ethnic cleansing. Can you say no to ethnic cleansing, Albo? Say no to ethnic cleansing, Albo. Palestine must be rebuilt by Palestinians and self-determination must be there. And the international community has an obligation to facilitate that. We need to be moving beyond these really simple notions of ceasefire where Israel, talks about its hostages. What about Palestinian hostages? The Palestinians that are, the thousands, almost 5,000 Palestinians have been rounded up into these gulags, by the Israelis. Almost 5,000. 2.3 million people that are in Gaza that can't leave, enter, go to school, worship. Remember, there's not a functioning school, not a barely functioning hospital. Hundreds of mosques and churches have been destroyed. There's no place to worship. There's no place to get care. There's no place to be educated. They've made Gaza unlivable on purpose. And it's also important for us to speak to that. People are talking about this being Trump's plan. It's not Trump's plan. Biden proposed it in May. Netanyahu was speaking about it in February. In fact, in November of 23, the generals of Israel released the general plan, which was for the Americans to induce, bribe, pay President Sisi, quote unquote, of Egypt to build a tent city in the Sinai. A tent city in the Sinai, so that Israel could complete the job. Well, what should happen, and here's international law in application, is per the International Court of Justice ruling in July last year that the settlements were illegal, that the settlers were illegally there, that there is no negotiating over something that is illegal. You stop doing what is illegal, that the settlers must be removed as soon as possible and the settlements dismantled. Well, as a Palestinian, we say the settlers have to go, but leave the settlements because we will house Palestinians in them in the very short term. Whilst we rebuild Gaza with your money, and the Palestinians that are Gazan will go back to Gaza, and the Palestinians that are from 48 Palestine, they'll go back to Palestine. That's international law. applied correctly. That's the Nasser plan. Get onto the Nasser plan. Don't worry about the Trump plan and the Netanyahu plan. Get onto the Nasser plan. Every Palestinian gets the choice to go home or get reparations or both. In fact, probably mostly both. So get onto the Nasser plan. Speak about it. There's more for us to do than just a ceasefire. Wherever you are, my friends, speak up loudly and proudly about Palestine. Palestine must be a vote winner and a vote coster this election. So don't be shy, speak up. Ask your MPs, your senators what their position on Palestine was. Go to the APAN website, apan.org.au, register to our mailing list so that we can keep you apprised of our election campaign as we roll into the election. Thanks for listening. Share the podcast, tell your friends, and remember, there's never been a better time for a free Palestine.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast. If you found it valuable, please consider donating or subscribing to support independent community radio. To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au.